Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 7th episode of A QISSAA with Ishika, quintessential and inspiring stories of South Asian artists. My name is Ishika Muchal, and I am coming to you from Los Angeles, California, which I want to acknowledge is the land of the Tongva people. Also, to everyone watching, happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. I am so excited to introduce to you my guest today, Ravi Rajan, who is a musician, creative producer, and president of the California Institute of the Arts. Oh, and I am totally not biased about Cal Arts. What? Mr. Rajan has served as Assistant Dean of Art and Design and the Dean of the School of Arts at Purchase College. As Dean, his initiatives there included helping to renovate the arts and design facilities, strengthening the school's philanthropic efforts, and creating a master's degree titled Entrepreneurship in the Arts to help students learn how to launch their own arts organizations. Mr. Rajan also taught students from kindergarten through university at various institutions and worked with faculty and artists on multimedia projects at Yale and the Rockefeller University. Mr. Rajan is an alumni of the University of Oklahoma and Yale. He is an accomplished musician, performing with and conducting for many large and small musical groups, as well as for theater. His practice also encompasses producing collaborative mixed media projects with artists, filmmakers, directors, and choreographers for museums, galleries, foundations, biennials, festivals, and venues, both private and public. Mr. Rajan is known for his development of innovative and visionary initiatives. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in London, a former member of the Tony Awards nominating committee, and a past president of the Asian American Arts Alliance. I am so honored to welcome Mr. Ravi Rajan.
Hi, Ishika.
Hello, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. This is terrific. First, I want to give credit to you, Ishika, for doing this. I think it's an important thing. This is the kind of thing that when I was a kid would have been great to have to see different South Asian artists featured and how they're engaging the world beyond the Tamil films that me and my family watched on only on weekends, of course.
Of course. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just hoping that someone who's watching who's either South Asian will be inspired to pursue their dreams in the arts, or people who are not South Asian can understand the unique challenges and accomplishments that we have as brown people in the entertainment industry.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I wanted to start off by asking you something from the beginning. How did you get introduced to the arts, and what made you decide that you wanted to pursue it as a career?
So those are two really separate questions. If I remember back, there are all sorts of things that happened to you growing up. So I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma. I was born in Seattle. My parents came from India. Before then, my sister was born in India, and then I was born here. And there's a saga of an immigrant story, including their other daughter who died before they came, et cetera, which I think many families, immigrant families, share these kinds of experiences. But suffice it to say, Dad had to come on a student visa, and so he came as a graduate student, and then eventually I was the citizen and they were not. Right? How that happens. And his first gig was at doing some research with the National Severe Storms Lab, and also that was called SIMS, the Center for something Mesoscale, et cetera, at the University of Oklahoma. So he was doing sort of atmospheric sciences and meteorology. That's what he did his degree on at the University of Washington. So fast forward, that was a year old at best when we moved to Norman. And I went, as you said, to the University of Oklahoma. So I spent the first 24 years of my life in Norman, Oklahoma. And what introduced me to the arts, I think I was very lucky. Some of the things like the Tummel films on the weekend that would, come in on VHS and the families would share them, the handful of families that would have them. And so those things happened. My uncle, my mother's brother, actually really enjoyed music. My mother's father, his father was a priest. And so music was a very important, a Hindu priest, and music was a very important piece of that, space of that. Of course, I don't fully know all of the pros and cons about artists and musicians and within sort of, Indian and Hindu society of that. But suffice it to say, there was an affinity there. There was also affinity for things like photography. Things like, recording music and engaging music. So he had that. His son actually plays mridangam very, very well, and was someone I always thought he would probably end up being a musician, but he didn't. On my trips over to Mumbai, they were living in Mumbai, working in Mumbai. He would play me recordings of like Lalgudi, Jayaraman, the violin player, and different things. And so I really engaged that. My father and mother also loved this. So we would, again, have those bootleg cassettes that you would be able to get, the Indian records, and hard to get in the United States. So I listened to a lot of those things. But of course, my whole culture around me in Norman was not that. It was, I listened to the radio. So I listened to pop music of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and in Oklahoma. That included country music. It included the notion of kind of like troubadour songs and the ballads and the songs, song structure. All of that stuff is there, but I'm listening to it. You don't know it when you're a kid. You're listening to Joni Mitchell on the radio, right? So, but I was very into music. I was very into photography, video, again, some of these things. So that same uncle, for my birthday, bought me a camera. And you can imagine, the immigrant story is all over the map. The sort of, the story of the professionals who come over and they do very well, and suburban life, and things are good, and the kids are, they have money. And then the story of the immigrants who really push through and have difficulty, and they have nothing and can't get credit, and all of those things. I'd say our story is kind of mixed. It had good moments and bad moments. There were moments where the family was on food stamps. There were moments where it was probably a fairly common life like others in Norman, Oklahoma would have. So all of that said, my uncle helped get me a camera for my birthday, Canon A1, and it was lovely and it was fantastic. And so, I would go to the public library and read the photo magazines, and got very much into sort of thinking about framing things that way and composing things in life like that. I was always very interested in computers too. So what happened was the public library had computers that nobody was using. And computers didn't do anything back then. You had to actually program them to do something, right? They were big calculators. So there were also books in the library on programming. So you put two things together and you're bored in the summer, and the library has good air conditioning, which is important in Oklahoma. So in the summer, so there you are. So I got into computers, programming computers. I got into obviously photography for music, and the music piece of it kind of blossomed. We didn't have a piano growing up, but in fifth grade, they allowed you to play an instrument in school. And it was only a stringed instrument at that point. And so I picked the viola because for me, that was interesting. And one thing that led to this moment is, an interest in classical music and Western classical music and how that happened. So in that same year, this is fifth grade. I'm watching great performances, PBS, the live from Lincoln Center, the things that are available on TV, and um, in one of the things they have the New York Philharmonic come up there, and there's an Indian man standing on the podium. And I thought, well, look at this brown guy standing on the podium in a tuxedo in front of all the white people with tuxedos, and they're doing what he's the leader. And I thought, wow, this is fascinating. This is interesting. And I had kind of heard maybe the names have been made up, but that was the moment where I was just like, oh, let's look this guy up, right? Getting back to the public library. And so the symbol of seeing that on broadcast television in the United States, in the New York Philharmonic. So this is, I didn't know that much about orchestras, but it had to be one of the important ones because it was the New York one, right? So that was a turning point, right? And so for a whole host of reasons, I think the performance they were doing was Rite of Spring. And so the opening of it, there's a bassoon solo, and it starts by itself, and it's haunting. It's an amazing line, right? Very important for bassoon players. And I thought, what's that? I want to play that, what that sound is, right? So sixth grade comes around. It's the summer before sixth grade. And I go to the band director, to play in band, et cetera, et cetera. And I was doing the viola. I was like, maybe we don't do the viola. We had rented the viola from the music store, gave it back. And so I said, can I play the bassoon? And the band director just looked at me and goes, in my entire life, no one has ever come and asked me to play the bassoon. And so he made me try the trombone and a couple other things, but I was hell bent on it. And part of the reason, frankly, that the bassoon was interesting is that you only had to buy a book and a reed because the school system was going to give you the bassoon and the vocals and everything else. And that's amazing, right? I mean, this is an instrument that even a beginner instrument costs thousands of dollars at that point, right? So there's no way a kid, you don't know you're going to stick with it, whatever. So that the school, again, the public library, the public schools had the access to these things. These were key to me, so it's a long way of talking about all of that. So suffice it to say, let's speed this up a little bit, right? I wanted to play jazz. You don't play bassoon in jazz. Miles Davis, all of this stuff started to come. A good friend of mine played the trumpet. I picked up his beginner one. I started playing around. He's like, you're a jerk. You're already playing it. So went to the band director then in high school and said, can I play trumpet in the jazz band, bassoon in the other? He said, okay, started playing trumpet in the jazz band. And then eventually when I was in high school at the very end, my senior year, we had 6 bassoon players, but one, which is amazing. You don't need 6 bassoon players, but one of us played, she played sax and I also played trumpet. So we switched to those instruments in the band. And in that final year, I'd say I was, writing some jazz songs, playing jazz, doing everything. And I was also reading, a lot of the stuff that we were reading was Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison, Native Son Richard Wright, Langston Hughes poems. There was a Ramar Bearden exhibition at the University Art Museum in town. And this kind of combination of the Black experience in the United States and my own sort of relationship with creating and engaging that space, all the while still doing the programming and the recording and the kind of photography stuff. It made me understand that the Black experience, I was able to understand and relate to that through art. Mm-hmm. And I was able to understand my own place in society. The opening of the Invisible Man, and it talks about, the way that those light bulbs, he describes the light bulbs in the room, and the way then later he describes the battle royale. It were all those conflicts and that understanding between the home culture, between the outside culture, between all of this. And it dawned on me till then I wanted to be, I loved kids. I wanted to be a doctor. I was just like, I'll be a pediatrician because you help kids be well, right? And it seems like fun. And it was a big shift in that moment. It just came to me. It's doctors help people live, but artists make people want to live. It gives people that reason. And to me, that was so powerful. It was the thing you started to have to chase. And so push come to shove, started a media company with a friend of mine. He's still there doing it. Did music and education in my undergraduate, then went to Yale graduate school. All of those lines of the computer programming and the video with the computers and the music, it all sort of combines. And then here we are.
So you were talking about how you grew up in Norman, Oklahoma, and I'm sure there weren't that many people around you who looked like you. So in that moment and now in your leadership positions, how have you ever felt like you needed to do something to fit in?
Oh yeah, especially as a kid, right? I mean, you don't know what to do, right? I mean, it seems inauthentic, and for that matter, you don't enjoy or like whatever it is that is to fit in or is the sort of mainstream or whatever. But it's always there that in some ways you feel like, boy, it would have been easier if I was like other people.
Mhm.
As you get older, you realize maybe everybody feels like that to some extent, right? Which is fascinating. Even the, in some conversations with some of the kids I grew up with, they felt that way, even though they were otherwise perceived. I was perceiving them as the mainstream. Some of that's kind of angst of being young, I think. But for sure, I mean, might describe it a little differently in that what continues to this day is that there are things and codes and ways that are sort of cultural and are there and are perceived, and they carry certain kinds of meaning and weight for people. And the whatever that code is, that meaning or that weight is sometimes not in your right. It doesn't help you. It's not in your advantage. You realize you're being perceived as way A, and it's who you are, right? And it may be a certain bias that they have, or a lack of experience, or whatever it is on the part of the perceiver, that there's very little you can do about it, right? And so that's there, and it's there to this day. And I would say, as I do more and more leadership things, it's more present than it was before. I mean, sometimes you can mind your own business and you can be an artist and you can do your things in the corner, and they may have those biases, but they don't really come to play on your day-to-day things. And I think when you're having to be the person who makes a decision on something or engages people in talking about making a decision on something, the biases kind of pull to the surface. So for sure. It fit in, not exactly, but definitely that sort of the differential in perception. It's a big thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that anyone ever feels like they have fit in, or that they don't need. Everyone is always trying to fit in, even if they are already fit in. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the hard part in leadership, I think the hard part is you don't get to always, because there's a weight with what the leader says, right? And it's perceived a certain way. You don't just get to be yourself all the time, right? You may have to have an opinion, but it is your job to ensure that other people also express their opinions. And there's always a balance, right? They'll want you to hear your opinion, but if you give your opinion even too early, others won't express theirs, right? And so it can be silencing, right? And even that has its own, oh, well, doesn't let me speak, or doesn't, So that's a hard balance. It's one of those things you have to maintain. You're always thinking about it and trying to figure that out, right?
Yeah. So how do you find that balance between like saying what you believe in or what your beliefs are, and then also representing the institution? For example, like in this situation, CalArts, like, do you ever feel like you need to filter what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, for the reasons I had talked about, I don't know if it's filter, it's timing, right? There's the right time to say the thing that you believe. Sometimes people don't want the leader to say what they believe. Sometimes they might think that and they might say that, but really they want to say what they believe, right? They want a moment to express whatever that is. The other piece of it is that my views are not always congruent with the views of the whole, right? And because I'm an individual and I can have my views, and I do have my views, but the things I might want to do and perceive are not always the right things for the institution to do at that time. And that's so it's less that my opinion, but it's like, well, if this were just me, I would do something else, but it's not just me, right? So that's one of those things about leadership that you again, it's one thing to learn and get used to, and I think it's the kind of thing that you just keep learning how to do better and better as you keep doing these kinds of roles.
Absolutely. So if we take things a little bit back, so when you were working as a musician and a collaborator, can you talk about one or two projects that you felt the most proud of that you worked on during that time?
So that's hard. I can talk about, I don't know if it's like as much as certain things, certain moments that may have been demonstrably, like they change your trajectory, right? So I mean, one thing early on, I told you about one of those moments related to, the art of the Black experience in the United States, Harlem Renaissance, et cetera, and how that, I'd say, more than any other single moment, because of course at that point you're 18, 17, whatever, right? And it has a big, you don't have a lot of life behind you. And so that kind of thing probably was the biggest trajectory shifter for me. There's always socially in South Asian cultures, the place of the artist is different. So not only are you navigating this sort of culture, home culture versus kind of Western European culture, you're also navigating the place of art in those things. And in neither culture is art sort of the high, yes, exactly. At the top of, in Western European culture, it comes from a certain kind of peasantry where you reported to the court or the king, and we could say like Beethoven was the first emancipated artist, right? He worked for himself, but before that, you were always under the patronage of somebody, right? And in India, many times it's the temple, it's the church, it's the religion, right? You were under the patronage of that system, for better or worse. We know it through dance. I mean, has a very difficult history in India with that, even in my lifetime, and not understanding that growing up, right? So that all of that's in there, right? In that moment of me for 17 years old. So in that way, I don't know. Some of my friends who knew me then are just like, it's a pretty bold thing for you to just be like, nope, going to go do art in the moment. It didn't feel like that to me because there's more years after that moment than before at this point. But maybe I'm sure it probably was. And in retrospect, thinking about it, that's important. From that point, it was an interesting thing. I kind of just, sometimes you're just like, those are these balls of yarn, right? And you kind of want to pull on the string and see where it goes. And so certainly with the media and the video and that stuff, that was that. Even though I didn't study it, that was photography, both still and moving image, and its relationship to the computer. This sort of advancing, the internet was brand new. I was doing a lot of things with like BBS systems, and before the internet, you had to like dial into computers, and that's how you would connect with one another, right? In the internet, you could say that you still would dial in to get into this thing called the internet. But once you were dialed in, that was cool. You had this relay chat, you had this, you were like, the bulletin board things were all connected at the same time. And that was like, whoa, this is cool. I remember thinking in that moment, I was just like, well, if everybody that was online all the time, you just connect it to like your TV and it would all be there, right? This is like, 89, right? And so what are we doing now? I mean, it's basically what happens, right? But it was pretty clear in that moment, like, oh, this is big. this is really a big thing. And so, you're unraveling that ball of string, and then being a musician and going to school for that, and that's all there. So I had lots of, there's some performances when I was in high school that were key, where in that same moment of kind of clarity, I remember performing something and thinking and realizing that it was just happening. Mm-hmm. I wasn't thinking about performing it. It was just boom, optimal experience, whatever you want to call it. And that it tingly, it felt weird. I mean, again, it's hard to describe whatever that feeling was. And then afterwards talking to the band director, and he said, yeah, that was it. And I didn't say anything. He came to me and he goes, you know what you did there? That was it. He could tell that was what was happening. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. That wasn't just this weird private thing that happened, right? It was this first realization that thing was and then again, you want to pull on that ball of string because that was awesome, right? And there were moments where I was making stuff up with friends and we were playing at other clubs or, like other people's houses, parties in college, just making up stuff and those things that would happen, right? It was those moments. Fast forward, I went to the Aspen Music Festival in the summer. I had wonderful moments of, things happen there. They just add up, right? Another really big one is that where these lines kind of cross. So I was at Yale doing graduate work. And then, of course, you have to pay to live. I had a really good scholarship, which was great, but there was additional tuition to pay and room and board and all of that. And so I started working at the IT because doing phonathon was like $6 an hour, but doing IT was $15 an hour. And so it's like, I'm doing the IT. So that was great. I was helping like Yale faculty with computing. And so this was like a brilliant history professor, but doesn't know how to use their email, right? Which is email was brand new then too. So it was great to meet all of these folks and do that. I helped set up a streaming server for the Department of Music there. I got, all the stuff that I was doing, kind of got into it. And then Yale said, hey, I was graduating. I was already playing some Broadway shows. And I was like, I'm going to New York. The goal was like, I'm going to go live in New York and have a buzzer and like order pizza and like do the New York thing. Right. And hit the subway. And I remember Yale came to me and they're like, hey, we'd like to hire you to do this stuff. I was like, oh, well, that's new. So I thought, well, if they want to hire me, somebody else probably wants to hire me. And I was not able to get a place to live in New York because you'd never been there. You have no history. Like, you're going to be a freelancer, right? And you're going to make it. So that was not going to happen, moving from New Haven to New York. So I ended up getting a job at the Rockefeller University doing media design, helping with the media center there. And that was fun. I wasn't there very long, but when I was there, Paul Greengard won the Nobel for protein kinase function in the brain, which was the discovery that led to us to have, these classes of psychopharmaceuticals. I can speak. So Zoloft, all of that stuff, right? The antidepressants. So that and the, dopamine function. And so it was great because he's having to explain this to the lay audience, if you will, in Sweden and in the US. And so making flash animations where, they talked about the protein kinase function and how that worked. That was fun, right? And so, got into that. But I did miss sort of teaching and engaging students, young people, and I liked the college age stuff. So I went to SUNY Purchase. And then I always tell people at that point, I worked myself up from the mailroom. So at SUNY Purchase, if we go back into this notion of these things that happened, it was great. I'm around faculty who are artists. This is fantastic. And there were moments. And I was just actually talking with one of them the other day. I said, I owe being able to get here to you. So while I was never your student, you're probably one of my, I'm probably one of your best students. I mean, I was formally, there's these conversations that you would have about, it's like, well, give me a list of artists that you think related to, concept and how that happens in the world. They said, oh, go look up, Adrian Piper and go look up General Idea and A. Bronson. And it's really, you start expanding sort of your understanding. And we would have visiting artists like we do at CalArt. So every week there would be a different artist come to a lecture and then do crits with students at the art school there. And there was one lecture by Alfredo Jar, who's an artist with whom I've done lots and lots of work. And I, it was ironic in this moment. I guess there was a foul up. Someone didn't pick him up from the train station. He was late and was going to talk. And so I was doing some work in my office late and I was like, should I go to this guy's lecture? He seems pretty cool. And then in comes the director of the art school, and she's like, "Oh my God, this late, and all of these things happen." And he's there, and he's got his laptop, and his media is not projecting right. And I'm like, "All right, I'll pick up my projector here, and I'll walk over there and make it work." Right. So you go over there, walk over it, put your projector in, make it all work. Then we're a little late at this point. He just starts the lecture, and I'm standing there. I'm like, so I'm sitting down now and listening to the lecture, I suppose. So I listened to this lecture and he talks about his public work that he's done in not in the space of galleries and museums, but in the space of the public. And it was a big part of what he was doing. And I was like, wow, this is fantastic. Again, that concept, I was just understanding people doing public interventions, right? And so this notion of social sculpture or whatever you want to call it was super awesome and fascinating. I was like, I didn't know this artist did this. This is cool. Yeah. And so I offered to give him a ride home back to Manhattan. And because of all the problems before, I was taking my projector back. And I said, hey, I live in Manhattan. You want me to just give you a lift back, given that it was so hard? And he looked at me and he goes, oh, that would be great. So he did a couple more crits and I hung out and waited for him. And then we drove back to Manhattan. And in that 45-minute drive, dropping him off, we had a lot of conversations. I talked about his work. I got to have my own, like, not crit, but one of these and in the car. And he was talking about his first film that he was editing and he was having trouble. And I'm just sitting there. And of course I've done this stuff. So I was just like, hey, did you try this and this and this? And the conversation got quiet for a second. And I realized he was turned and was like staring at me. And I'm like, and he's like, would you like to come to the studio and talk about it? I'm like, oh, sure. And so went to the studio, I think that week. What I didn't know was this film was being premiered at Grand Arts in Kansas City that weekend, like that following weekend. So I went I think this was the end of the previous week. I went the following Tuesday, helped them resolve the thing, render the problem that they were having that wasn't working. And they had the premiere, right? And then he's like, I'll call you. But you never think, I'll call, what does this mean, right? You give him your card and then I'll call you. And then you go on with your life. And then, I don't know, a couple months went by and he calls and he said, I have some ideas for projects. I just want to hang out with you and let's bounce off ideas and figure out if we can. And that's what started it. And so since then, we've done lots and lots of different things of the things that are related to this.
Absolutely. And for anyone who's just joining us right now, this is a QISSAA with Ishika, and I'm here with Mr. Ravi Rajan, president of CalArts. And if you're watching on YouTube, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. A little plug.
So that is another moment, an artistic moment, and there were a whole set of productive things that came there. And that's where, you know, when you asked, you're like, you're a musician. I'm like, yes. Sort of. Yeah. So yes, I mean, I love making music. I love doing all of those things. On a day-to-day basis, I don't perform a whole lot anymore because, you know, when I started doing some of that, what I call creative producing, whatever you'd like to, collaborative work with other artists, it often was when they were doing things that they had never done before. Being able to engage artists where I'd like to be in a different space. I have some ideas. I don't know if the ideas are compatible with those media. I don't know how all of that. So really in the space of discourse about the ideas of the work, letting whatever the media is follow from whatever the idea is. And this should sound familiar to you as a CalArtian. It is kind of how the whole school is there. So, you know, fast forward when I got a call saying, you know, Stephen Levine is retiring after 29 years, the president of CalArts, is that something you'd be interested in? I was like, oh, wow. I mean, I didn't know CalArts through this whole period of my life until I started at SUNY Purchase. My relationship was the composition faculty in my undergraduate had gone to CalArts. And so she talked about it's a very CalArts thing. And we had an improv ensemble and all sorts of very CalArts kind of stuff. And, I was like, oh, that's interesting. But I never really looked into what CalArts was until, you know, there were CalArtians that you were associating with, artists and alumni and et cetera in SUNY Purchase in my sort of time in New York. And that's where it's like, oh, it's a formidable place. And so when the call comes in and knowing that the place was oriented that way from the beginning, I was like, oh, well, this would be a tremendous, amazing opportunity. And it is. And it is.
Yeah, and you are the first Asian American president of CalArts and the first Indian American president of any arts university in the country. So can you just talk about, I guess, the pressure and responsibility of being the first of anything?
You know, I don't think about it. I didn't think about it too much when I started, I have to say. It was like a first, and it was like, okay, well, this is society evolving. But after I was in the job, things started to pop up. And it was kind of like what I was talking to you before, people would have their biases. I realized very quickly, and I was worried about this because I kind of call it the Obama syndrome. And part of that is just like, he couldn't screw up. I mean, like, think about the weight, like there was going to be no scandal with Obama. There could not be, because everybody was gunning for there be one. Not everybody, but lots of people. And so the scrutiny was higher, right? And I remember in that moment feeling joy when he was elected, and at the same time feeling, oh my God, like that's what a heavy thing, right? Yeah, maybe I'm sure he felt that. I didn't think about it, like I said at the beginning, but then as time went on, you started to interact. I would interact with students, right? And I'd interact with students like you, and it was like, again, the symbol was super important. It was super powerful. And I didn't think about it, right? I didn't think, oh, in Zubin Mehta, that was important. That was powerful, right? But it was so much that some, you know, Indian students would come to me and say, other Asian students would say, I'm doing this, but my parents really didn't want me to come, and they're paying for me to come. And so I don't know how I'm getting through this. And then I'm in class and they say, it doesn't matter. Don't think about making money. And they'd start crying. You know, and I'm just like, oh, wow. So, I mean, those are the moments where you really think, okay, that does mean something, right? And it's, what do I do with that, right? And, you know, to spend the time to tell that student the truth and say, you know, you can be utopian and talk about things like, oh, well, the money doesn't matter, et cetera, and you want to be Marxist or whatever. But that's theory, right? What happens tomorrow is that you have to eat. And so it's important for us to think in the space of the theoretical and the imaginative and do those things. But as artists, we have to connect the dots too. We don't get to just live in the theoretical world, right? And I think that's one of the most important things that artists do. If you just lived in the talking world and the theoretical world and that idea world, then I never would have read The Invisible Man. If he hadn't written it, I wouldn't have read it. And if I hadn't read it, the chain reaction doesn't start. And so it's so important to make the art happen, right? For the artist, right? But the more important thing is the artist than the art, right? And it's something I think we really do believe at Cal Arts. So, related to being Indian, there's I don't think about it a lot. I'm reminded of it. That's maybe the better way to think about it. I'm reminded of it when that someone has an opinion about whether I'm going to do something one way or not. And you realize that the opinion's based in the fact that, Indians eat with their hands or whatever it was, and then stuff still comes up saying, I wonder if he knows how to use a fork and knife. I mean, there's stuff like that happens all the time.
Oh, wow.
So yeah. Because people don't know, you're walking around, it depends on the context in which you meet them. I'm at some fancy dinner. They probably don't have that expectation. Right. So, it's interesting. And again, I guess growing up in Oklahoma, I start from a default that people don't mean it.
Okay.
If someone doesn't, they have the inherent bias that they have, right? And a lot of that is because they weren't exposed to something, they don't understand it, or what they were exposed to was whatever they saw, some prejudicial thing on TV or what their parents told them or whatever, right? Yeah. They don't know, they don't know. And it's like, if I have an opportunity to let them know every time that occurrence happens. And that's the sort of thing that keeps me, I think you can be angry about it, right? Yeah. But it doesn't help. If I was just angry about it, I wouldn't be the president of Cal Arts, for sure. Because how do you get past those moments, right? I mean, because in the end, someone is bringing value in the way that they're bringing value to whatever it is you're doing. So what do? Just immediately vilify them and tell them to go suck an egg? I mean, I don't know that works, right? I don't know that it makes me any better. I don't know if it makes that person any better. I don't know if it makes us move forward with whatever we were trying to do in that situation, right? On the other hand, it makes having conversations with people like you nice. And I don't get those conversations that often, right? Sometimes I get to talk with students of color, the Black Arts Collective or the Asian Students Group, and it's great. It's fascinating. We had a thing with the Black trustees with the collective, the Black Arts Collective at Cal Arts. It was amazing. It was one of the best conversations I'd been. I was really a fly on the wall, but unbelievable. Because they were just talking about it, right? They were talking about all this crap that we're talking about right now. And it's that solidarity, the knowing that it happens to other people, like, oh my God, it happens to Don Cheadle. Oh my God, it happens to ... right? I'm not alone. That solidarity helps, right?
Absolutely. And I think that what you were talking about, the only way that people are going to know about us is if that we are an ambassador for ourselves and our culture, because it's so rare, especially for South Asians and like Asians in the arts, that we literally represent everyone who looks like us when we go into a place like that. So there's so much weight on the shoulder, but it has to be done. Otherwise those stereotypes keep getting.
Well, and don't think about it. I mean, in the sense that we'll normalize it just by being there. You don't have to do anything special. You could just do the thing that you do great. And it's like, oh, I guess Indian guys can be presidents of important art schools. Yeah. Right? I mean, like, that's the conclusion that one would reach after a certain period of time, right? Mm-hmm. So I just think we just have to do and keep doing. It's that whole thing where, I mean, if you think about it, don't screw up, right? On the other hand, that's not going to help us if we put that artificial pressure on us. In the sense, I think it's being reminded that even just your presence in those ways. I mean, as sad as the story with the student who came to me and started crying and all of this stuff is to one extent, there's a nice part about it because she felt compelled to come to me. Mm-hmm. She felt and those are all positive things, right? And I think that helps.
Absolutely. And can you talk about, let me phrase this better. So the arts field, like the people that we see as art, like the actors and the performance aspect, is slowly but surely starting to diversify. But I feel like the creative team and like the executives and the producers and basically like the leadership side still has like a lot of progress to go. So can you talk about how it feels to often be the only person of color at the decision-making table?
Maybe it's fairly familiar because that's the way my entire life has been. I mean, you say that like as if I could compare about it being another way. That's hard because I don't know what it feels like to be in another way. And that's been that way since I was a kid, since growing up in Oklahoma. I mean, I was the only Indian in at the dinner table for an event. I'm the only Indian at whatever, or one of two or three, right? Or if you're lucky. I think I notice it when those pieces of bias become apparent. I don't think about it as you're just sitting there having a discussion, but I think about it when I've approached something and it may be kind of Indian in the way that I approached it, and others don't recognize, it's different, right? I mean, it's like that cultural difference creates a little bit of, you have to explain, and I don't want to. But I think it's interesting, and that's there. It's when there's judgment upon those differentials. I mean, just that happening is great. And of course that happens the more diversity you have if you're working as a team, the more those kind of things will crop up. That's not bad. That's good, because I learn about what those other, cultural ways and doing things, and they learn about mine, and I learn about the other, and blah, blah, blah. So, but it's when that comes to loggerheads, when the bias sort of prevents something from happening, is when I notice it the most. So I don't know if that's when I think about it. Do you know what I'm saying? It's generally when it crops up. And sometimes other people remind me of it. And maybe that's just me being naive or slow or stupid or whatever. But sometimes I'll plug through it and they're just like, you realize they're really not hearing you the way you think that they're hearing you. And I'm like, no. And that's why it's important to have people around you. It's like, nah, from your mouth, that sounds different because you're the president, because you're Indian, because whatever, right? Because you studied music and whatever it is, that's causing whatever those things to be, right? And so, that's those are also the moments that you're reminded about cultural differences, if you will.
Absolutely. And if you had the power to, what changes would you bring in terms of diversifying the leadership of not
the
just
creative arts? To me, there's two things. If I could just wave a magic wand, the structures that you speak of, the where producing teams and et cetera, where the decisions are made to say green light this movie or would be representative. You would see that being representative of the population and the cultures around that for which it's acting for, yes. Right? That's not the case. But I think as equally important is that if that's the goal, you could just put people into those places and it doesn't solve the issue. It's the cultural learning and understanding, and that framework is just as important. You have to have the representation as well as the cultural allowances. Let me give you an example. Let's stick with the school thing, right? Is that okay? Well, the faculty of a school don't represent the if in its sort of let's say ethnic diversity, the faculty of a school don't represent its surroundings of the school, the student body of the school. There are a lot of, but maybe it doesn't actually match any of those things. Mm-hmm. In that case, okay, well, we make the point to hire faculty so that they match. Mm-hmm. Did we solve the issue?
No.
Maybe not, right? Because while the representation exists, the cultural things that were there for a long, long time don't just get solved when you've hired the person, right? Mm-hmm. Because people from different cultures, for instance, they're facing those biases in the processes and the things that the Institute does, right? So those are still there. So if you don't think about the structures and the processes as well as the representational stuff, that doesn't move forward. So when I say wave a magic wand, I mean both things, right? You might see it demonstrated in the representation, right? But we need to see it demonstrated in things like the content and the rules and the structures and all of that stuff too, right? Yeah. And this is, I think, if there is something in this moment, it's a shame it takes George Floyd to be murdered for the zeitgeist potentially to shift. And I say potentially because let's see if it sticks. But I think we're talking about that more than we talked about that in the years before. That's that much I at least, or I'm freer to talk about it than I was before. Because when I bring it up, I think there were fewer people who would say, I think I know what you're talking about, right? There are more who are like, oh yes, I recognize that there are two sides to this, right? And that the representation, we're not even there, much less with the cultural thing. And right, but you got to move them simultaneously. Because if you create a differential there, you're just going to burn out the people that you hired because they're going to hit their head against the wall. You were kind of getting at that as the first Asian American, right? It's hard because they're making certain assumptions that you can do A, B, C, or D, and you may not be able to do that because culturally you weren't prepared, because economically you weren't prepared, because of whatever, right? So.
Yeah, it's not just representation, it's like the whole conversation to get to the accurate representation.
Yeah, and so, waving a magic wand is nice and all, but I know that that's actually a lot of work and the time to make that work happen. And I think if we do it with the intent, we'll get there. That much I'm sure of it, right? But we just have to be conscious and be purposeful in that work that we do and have difficult conversations about it. Because again, the implicit part of it is what makes it hard. You don't realize that stuff is there, right?
Absolutely. And well, process. It's all a process, I guess. Yeah. So stepping outside of the representation, whichever way you would like to answer this, in all the institutions that you have worked for, has there been a common central goal that you have worked towards creating in that institution?
Not necessarily one goal. I mean, I guess when I'm in a leadership role, I feel like the leader's job is to try and understand what the institution is, where it is, and where it needs to go. And that's a product of kind of all the stakeholders, all the people involved, its own history, where it is. So there's not one thing, but I guess what I'm talking about could be the thing. And that is trying to get institutions or groups or whatever to recognize the moment that they're in and then coalesce around where they want to go. That's probably the common thread. So it's not not where it should be, could be different depending on that group, right? But the process of that, I think, has been the thing to do. And the way to get that process is to get people involved, if you will, in engaging that. That goes all the way to thinking about how artists, so we engage artists, right? As a school we define ourselves as a community of artists. And the whole point is that we are in a space of where artists are, as the mission says, transforming ourselves, each other, and the world, right? And so the world part is certainly important when artists are engaged and in the world. What does that mean? And how they take part, active part as in the active citizenry of wherever they end up being, right? As an artist, it's important if you're in India to engage the socio-political things that are happening, the things that are happening with, with the government, with Modi, et cetera, et cetera. Not engaging in that means that in a democratic framework, it doesn't represent your views yet. So you have to engage, right? You have to take part in that. So that sort of a democratic framework doesn't work if the citizenry doesn't engage, right? To me, artists not engaging in the citizenry is a problem, right? That's why artists get overlooked in the larger scheme of how they're important to society, right? They think art is so often there's this feeling, like this fetishization that artist is the genius in the corner, but also crazy. And they do a thing that's not for me. That's like museums and this other stuff that happens, right? But those people read the newspaper, they watch movies, they listen to music, they do all those things, right? And they're not thinking that that's art, right? They think that art is this other abstract or esoteric thing. But in fact, it's just all around us all the time, especially with media changing so much, the need for the artist. I mean, you look at a package, it's the stuff that's on the package was designed by an artist. I'm sorry. That's like artists' work are all around us, right? And so it's really important that that's recognized in society. And the only way for that to happen is for artists themselves to take part in it. And that's super important.
Mm-hmm. And you were talking about how citizenry and like the artist as a global citizen is really important. So, and one of your initiatives at CalArts that I really admire was the ride to the polls in 2018 and like creating CalArts as a polling place for voting last year. So was that a similar impetus? Like what was the impetus behind that?
Well, two things. One, remember the thing I said right before, and that is, where do you want to go and how does that work? And in hearing the students, there was a great interest in getting involved in how that works in the citizenry. And it's like, fantastic, right? Again, I already told you my predilection of like, I think we have a responsibility as artists to engage as citizens. And there were students asking the same question. So to me, I was like, great. So you're interested, let's find a way to get, to help that, to engage that interest. So that's the first thing, because it was the right thing, right? I think in years past, CalArts, the student body wasn't that interested in doing that stuff, right? But it was, and that's super important. And then number two, it's exactly as you said, because of my view that, students have to engage. And it's interesting in a place like CalArts where, a quarter of the students are actually international from a lot of different countries, right? Mm-hmm. So their relationship to voting could be very interesting and different. And one thing they can learn is how that happens in the United States. I mean, they can like, oh, this is interesting. There's polls, there's a system, the government is that way. So as an international student, it's another piece of experience that you gain, right? So even if you couldn't vote, it was super interesting in there. And then if you could, if for some reason you hadn't built that practice, because you were just starting to be able to vote at 18, right? So if you were an undergraduate, this may be the first election that you're voting in. You didn't know how to register. You didn't know how to get all that stuff. That becomes important. So again, if that's available to you, you're like, oh, I see. You register. Oh, you can register because those forms are available at CalArts. I can just sign up. And then how does this happen? Oh, that's the date. How do I get to the poll? I'm an out-of-state student and I don't have a car and I live in the dorms. Oh, we'll find a way. It's not far, but why don't you go with some others, right? Again, the solidarity helps a huge deal. And so it's a small thing, right? It was a small thing to say, we got vans, we got people that could drive them. That's great, right? And I kind of I don't get a chance to hang out with the students and see what they're doing that much. So whenever there's those little opportunities, I was like, well, I'll drive the shuttle a couple of times. Let me. They were all like, don't wreck. Like, don't hurt any students, right? They're like there were ground rules, like make them wear their seatbelts. Yeah. I mean, so that's, it's an important, it's exactly to what I was talking about.
Yeah, definitely created a lot of, I guess you could say, civic accessibility at CalArts.
Yeah. And I think that can only grow. The hope is wherever they end up, that's important. And the CalArts community, Santa Clarita is big, but the CalArts community is an important piece of it. And so while from a sociopolitical space, there could be differentials because it's a very kind of a lot of kids from out of state, international. And so what is the CalArts community's influence on Santa Clarita, which is otherwise homogeneous in a different way, right? And that's good. That's important. Like, again, engaging so that people in Santa Clarita are like, oh, this is a very diverse place and a very international school and it's right there. And that's important to know. So them seeing students around. I mean, it's interesting. I've gone shopping and doing some things up in Santa Clarita, and residents are coming to me, I'll be wearing CalArts t-shirt or something, and they'll say, oh yeah, you were at CalArts. That's great. Don't tell them who you are, right? And they're like, you work there? I'm like, yeah, I work there. It's like, not having the students around this year, it's a bummer, man. They noticed, right? And it's fantastic. I thought, well, that's very interesting, right? And again, not a huge student body. We're less than 1,500 students, right? But noticed in all of those places in Santa Clarita, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, that's so nice to hear that we are recognized. Like, we always feel like this kind of city on a hill kind of thing, but we are part of the community.
Yeah, you get it. You got to go to the grocery store somewhere, right? Yeah. So you got to go get tacos somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And talking about the pandemic, this is going to be a large question, but how has that impacted you personally and like your experience as president of CalArts? Well,
I talked a little bit. That's an interesting segue. It's been real hard. I mean, I got into doing this because if you rewind to what I told you is that I stopped just doing this professional stuff in the world and added this because I wanted to be around students, particularly college age students. That meant a lot to me. That was important in my, like, what I do when I grow up should include college age students, right? Yeah. And so that had become clear because I had done without. And this is the first time since I had that realization and committed to saying I'm going to work in those environments that I have not been around college age students for an entire year. So I feel the same way that I did when I realized that's the thing I wanted to do, right? I mean, ironically, I have been with them, just not with them, right? So one of the magic things about CalArts is in that space, in that community, it's this kind of generative thing where you bump into people, you see them in the parking lot, you see them at the cafe, you do that sort of thing. And it's always great. I mean, never short of, you can literally just walk around and start to get an idea of what students are doing. Like what, when the graffiti in the sublevel doesn't change for an entire year, you don't really know what the students are thinking, because that's where you could go to see where they would express those things. So, I mean, that's been really hard. I mean, personally, kind of emotionally difficult, because it's confusing. Like, what am I doing? I'm working, I'm doing all these things. And, there's a lot of hard stuff that we've had to do in this year. You have to remind yourself it's for the students. And while you can't feel that presence yet, it won't be long. And there are, students are already starting to come back, which has been fantastic. And again, so part of it is just recognizing how good it makes me feel when I see the students, like, using a dance studio or doing something, and seeing them come in to do it. It's like, oh, right, here we go again. Right. And this is how this works. So that's been super hard. And, but it's over. Right. And then it's not going to snap your fingers and come back, but it's on its way to being better. So
slowly. We're almost there. I'm looking forward to being back.
Almost there.
Yeah.
Get your vaccination if you're listening to this. And if you're having problems, let us know if you're a CalArtian.
I have my second dose appointment right after this.
Excellent.
And talking about how you knew that you wanted to have college students as a part of what you do. If you had a control over your legacy, what would you want it to be?
You mean for CalArts or just in general?
Like your personal legacy.
That's a big question. I hope I would love when I'm dead for people, if they ran across something I did, that it was clear to them that, oh, well, he was trying to give voice to people who otherwise might not have had that, and help them engage in the world as it starts to transform. I mean, that's the most general I could be about it, right? And that, that he really understood that, and that in doing that the arts were an important piece. It's human expression, right? And so that it's like he was a champion for human expression. He was a champion for free human expression. And in so doing, was able to amplify voices of people who otherwise were not listened to in the same way. That would be amazing, tremendous, right? And again, if they could glean that just from something I did, that would be amazing.
That's beautiful. I'm sure it will be. Yeah. And as this show is called, it's called QISSAA with Ishika. I just mispronounced my name. That was fun. But can you tell us a QISSAA or episode from your life that has been very influential on your trajectory? It can be in the arts, outside of the arts, anything.
Wow.
All the heavy questions at the end.
I guess so. Yeah. It's easier to do story time. I think I've had, during the stories, I think we've talked about a lot of them, right? This is a hard one. I can come back to you. You can come back to it. I mean, it's hard to put we've had a conversation about many of them. That's a hard one. You stumped me.
Awesome. Well, we can come back to it if you think about it, but you have shared a lot of stories as well that would qualify for that category. So.
Yeah, I think we're a product of the experiences. So, I mean, part of, I think what you're hearing is that I really do believe that we're a product of the experiences we have as human beings, and that it's very important to gain as many of those as possible. As a parent, I try to do that for my kids, in that, let's have them try a different food and hear a different music and engage a different whatever, right? And be in different cultural and social and those situations, because I think that their formation is a part of all of those things, right? I mean, I was lucky enough to do a project in Johannesburg, right? And so both of them are like kids. And what I would always do is when I had to be gone for like a month, right, I would bring them along. So while that was expensive, you had to pay for all those tickets or whatever. At least I was living in a hotel room somewhere, so we just all cram in together. And while I was doing that for a couple of weeks, they could just go, you'd tell the teachers, be like, no, they're going to Johannesburg for 4 weeks. Right. And so then they were able to go do things, and all the teachers would say, oh, do an alternate assignment, because it's a great opportunity. And so I can talk to them now about, it's amazing that when I was my kids' age, I went to India, which was super different than most kids my age in Oklahoma, but, it was harder to travel. It was more expensive. And so them having those experiences are great, because Steve Biko comes up and they're like, oh yeah, they like talking about it. It's like, wow, it's an amazing, that's what I'm saying, is that all of those stories I'm telling you, I'm a product of all of those things that changed my life. So is there one that's important? I think there isn't one that may be more important than another, because we don't even know how they relate to one another, right? Mm-hmm. That car ride with Alfredo, you could say was important, or the projector breaking, you could say was important, right? I mean, mundane yet super important, because maybe I don't go to that lecture, so then maybe I don't have the car ride, so then maybe he doesn't need. He finds another way to fix his film, right? So.
Each chain in the link. Absolutely.
That's it, right? And so it's hard for me to pick one chain that's super meaningful. Maybe it really is that kind of optimal experience, for lack of a better term, when I was 18, that it was like, oh, like all of that stuff coming together, and art having that sort of heavy weight on me, right? Mm-hmm. And again, those are normal things students do. They read Ralph Ellison, and they go see an art museum, and then they play in the band. But for me, that it did something very different, right?
Absolutely. And you were talking about your children, so I think this is a great transition to our last question. What advice would you have for younger students, younger kids, or basically anyone who is looking to pursue a career in the arts or arts leadership?
Well, the general piece of advice was, remember how I described it? Like there were these interesting balls of string and you kind of wanted to pull on them. Mm-hmm. Find the interesting balls of string and don't be afraid to pull on them. Mm-hmm. Don't talk yourself out of pulling on the ball of string, particularly the younger you are, because as you get older, you have less time to explore the other ball of string that's over there, right? And mm-hmm. so because somehow you've pulled on a bunch, you just have to keep pulling on them, right? So sometimes there's consequences to stopping. So try everything that you can. Like try all of that stuff. And if you want to pursue it in the arts or the creative arts, don't let what I'm going to do when I grow up stop you from trying something or doing something. Because just like I was saying, it's a chain reaction of things. You never know that if you had told me, it's like, oh yeah, I was purposefully programming computers when I was 8 years old because I knew that would be helpful because the world would essentially work that way. And then the merging of media and computers would be a huge developmental piece of what I did. That's not why I did it. I did it because it was there. And I thought, I want to make it work. That's all. It's just sitting there occupying space. It was nothing more complicated than that. So I think that's it, right? My advice is that if you want to do something, in the creative fields, then try it, right? And the things in life doing are not easy to do. So as you get resistance and things happen and wow, this is hard, and find a way to keep doing it. I'm reminded of that when, my sons get upset if they're playing piano and some things are going well, and there'll be the one thing that's kind of hard, right? Because what's hard for people when they're doing something is different for every person. We all have the way our fingers are made or whatever it is that we're doing, right? So there'll be something that's hard for him and he'll get super frustrated. And you think in that moment, it's probably like, if there's nothing else that you learn from playing the piano, that's an important thing to learn, that you have to find a way to smooth through that and you will figure it out, right? That's empowering and that's important. So I think ultimately that's the thing. Don't be afraid to try the stuff that you're interested in. Give it an honest focused attention. Don't be afraid to pull on those balls of strings that are interesting to you. And don't don't worry about where it's going to lead you at first. Because I think that that will make itself known. And it will probably be another ball of string in which you have to pull on. If you're confident in that, I think people will be okay, right? And in doing that, engage others, create that solidarity that I've been talking about, be with groups, because, the safety in numbers thing is very, very important. When you help someone do something, you never know how that's going to come back. And it's every time we can unfurl that if you wanted. I could have a whole hour unfurling that. Is this like, you just did the gesture for someone because you could. And it's like, well, that seems like the right thing to do. And it has always come back to me in some other way.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you so much. And
yeah,
thank you in general for just being here. This conversation has really been very inspirational and honestly lifted a little weight off of me. Because I always feel like the pressure to represent everyone who looks like me whenever I go into a space where I'm the only one. And what you said really had an impact. So
the most important thing you have to do is represent you.
Mm-hmm.
And you are South Asian, so you don't have to try.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. It'll be the thing that you do naturally. There's no wrong way. Really, that's true, right? And your presence alone in the space is that's enough, right? But
mm-hmm.
be true to that thing that you want to do in it. You're putting artificial pressure on yourself. That's not worth it.
Yeah, that's good to know. I will take that off. Great. Thank you so much for joining me. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. And thank you to everyone who is watching. Make sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And our next episode will be on a Wednesday this time. So we're not going to have one on Mother's Day, but it'll be on May 12th at 7 p.m., which is a Wednesday. And in the meantime, please be sure to stay safe, get your vaccine, wear a mask, and if you can, donate to an organization that's helping India right now, because they could really use some help. And if I could ask you to, whenever you can, watch a movie or listen to a song of a culture that you don't know about. And thank you so much.